Shall we start now, ma'am?
Hello. Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Shall we now start, ma'am?
Yes, I can begin, not a problem. Are we waiting for someone or you're just live screening it? Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, are we waiting for somebody to join or should I begin the presentation?
We can start now, ma'am.
Okay, fine. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Riyanka Sarkar and I'm an assistant professor of English in St. Claret College, Bangalore. And I'm also a research scholar in Geetam University, Bangalore. And my area of research is partition of India, primarily with the partition of Bengal. So I'm looking into the identity and fear issues, which have been transmitted through generations in the partition immigrants. And that's a very broader aspect. I'm not going to discuss all, those things here. This will be largely, based on the partition of Bengal. So when we talk about the partition of India, even today, it has its aftermath. It's not an incident that took place and it got over. It is largely like the Holocaust of India, something which will be remembered for ages. And we all know that India gained her independence in yeah, okay. So India gained her independence on 15th of August 1947 after a prolonged struggle, with the British, but it was not at the cost of something, very fruitful. We had the permanent division of lines which incurred in the country, and as a result, something which impacted throughout, and even today, because the preceding generations had to suffer. And the fruit of the independence was, of course, the partition of India, which was as deadly as the colonial rule. So, statistically, if we go, it's more than 1 million people who were killed and more than 10 million were displaced. And this is considered to be the largest, displacement of refugees, and the refugee crisis existed, worldwide. Because with such huge statistics, when people make a move, across the nation, it creates a lot of crisis in the new nation as well, to rehabilitate the refugees, to get them job, to get them lodging. They might, get involved in a lot of criminal activities due to lack of food and provisions. And as such, this has become a huge national crisis. And the biggest, you can say, the victim of the partition was definitely women, after children. So, like Urvashi Butalia had rightly said, victory is celebrated on women's body and vengeance is executed on women's body. So, in either way, it is women who had to suffer. And during the partition phase, women were the one who had, who had to suffer the utmost brutality of partition. For men, it was death. It was maybe the most brutal death, the most unbelievable death. But women were not killed because they were considered to be trophies that could be celebrated, that could be molested, that could be destroyed over and over, to a point that women actually desired death. And it was not just the abduction that affected women. It was also that their own family denied to accept them after the partition, after they were abducted. And there's a very beautiful writing, where there's a character called Lajwanti. The name of the text is Lajwanti. And here, Lajwanti is basically a very shy and a coy kind of a wife who had an abusive husband. And during the partition, she was abducted by a Muslim man, and the husband fell, crestfallen. He was extremely sad. He was upset, But he also noticed that all those families whose women were abducted had boycotted or blacklisted those women. They had permanently decided to forget them. And when the both the countries decided to exchange the women and children, the abducted women and children, these families refused to accept those women back, and these women had nowhere to go. They were either not accepted by the abducted families, or they did not want to go back to a traumatic past of harassment or all the things that went on. And they were not even accepted by their family because they were considered to be disgraced women, fallen women, whose chastity has been violated, whose purity has been violated, and they were uttermost negativity or filthy things that could be practiced on them, traumatizing them with different slurs, abusive slurs. And the worst part was that the other women who succeeded in crossing the borders without facing any abusive sexual or physical violence were the ones who digged into this violated women, who passed comments like we were so chaste. Just because we are good women, we have been chaste and nothing had come upon us. It might be that these women had done something, and as such they had to bear the brunt. They are evil women. In fact, there also the society clamor where they shouted that these women had the audacity to come back to the country and family after getting violated, after having been, raped, and after becoming a fallen women. Why didn't they commit suicide or hang themselves, or fall in, jump into a well and kill themselves? They are impure. A pure woman would have killed herself before getting violated. And they even glorified many women by saying that the moment they had come to know that the partition broke in, and the other person had come to attack the women, they had killed themselves. So they were somewhere glorifying jihad, glorifying self-killing, self-immolation, suicide, by saying that this is what a pure woman does. At the cost of death, even if you die, your chastity should be preserved. And if you're violated, you should not come back, you should kill yourself. So the sexual harassment, the physical trauma, the utmost harassment that women faced, as if it was not enough, the society was not ready to accept them. Now, over 75,000 women were raped, killed, abducted, or their traces could not be found. So the statistics, it couldn't give a details about these women, who were raped, who were killed, abducted, and who were not even found. Let's say women who were raped and who were dug on the ground, women who were abducted, whose family refused to, report. The statistics is distorted because it fails to document the number of women and children who committed suicide or were killed by family members to save honor. Now, Urvashi Butalia mentions this thing in her book, this Other Sides of Silence, where family members, they killed the women in their family. It can be young daughters, it can be adult daughters, wives, sister, even mother, or any other women in their family members. They attempted to kill them because they felt that killing them by the family members is with much kindness, with much, you can say, lesser cruelty than being killed by the enemies or the violators, because you may not know what they will do to you. They may not kill you. In fact, that is the most traumatic thing. They will let you leave only to suffer trauma. So it's better that the family member kills. So this was a notion which was practiced largely by the family. And secondly, to save the family's honor as well, because a woman, the moment she was violated, she brought disgrace to the family. And as such, to save the family's honor, these women were killed. And also, a number of women and children committed suicide on their own. Women who had young children killed the children and committed suicide. Many of them who were abducted, whose traces were not found, who were abducted and killed, whose family never reported, never questioned. So the statistics that we received is a rough idea, but it is estimated a large more number of people had undergone the trauma and the violence of partition. See, the building of the new nation was a refugee generating process, and partition of India on the basis of religious division was a brilliant example of this process. So, therefore, the partition of India had only created more poverty by, generating more refugees. Efforts to create homogeneous nation states change some subjects into minorities who find themselves on the wrong side of new borders or the wrong state with the wrong ethnicity, language, or religion. Minorities are made to feel they should belong somewhere else, that they should be nationals of some other new state made up of people like them. Therefore, those people before the partition who were probably of the upper caste, who were the landlords, or who were rich and led a very luxurious life, who had lots of properties and land, one find when they were asked to abandon everything and make a shift to a new nation, they were suddenly released or, reduced to the status of minorities. And they could only live in their past. They could never have or frame they could never create the past ever in their life because it was forever gone. Now, when we study partition literature, it can be broadly divided into two categories. Writers who wrote about the causes of partition or what prompted the violence, that is, how the partition of India began and what were the reasons, who were primarily to be held responsible, and writers who spoke about the aftermath of the event, the trauma and the suffering, and the condition of the preceding generations, the memory of it. Now, we all know that, the Punjab is the first state whose partition is widely understood, and it takes the central frame when we talk about the partition of India. So primarily there are three states to undergo partition. So first is Punjab, and we can see the areas that are marked in green had become Pakistan therein after a brutal, bloodshed, violent. It could be the most violent, partition memory ever. The second state to undergo partition was Bengal. Partition of Bengal was also proposed earlier by Lord Curzon in 1905, but later it was, seen as a means how Bengal was being separated on the basis of religion, and as such, there was tremendous pressure and tremendous protest. And during the Swadeshi movement, the proposal was cut off, curtailed, and then again Bengal was reunited. But in 1947 was the permanent partition of Bengal took place. We can see the dark green line as the East Bengal region. Bengal always had a bifurcated cultural division, East Bengal and West Bengal. And East Bengal was a Muslim dominated area, which ultimately became Bangladesh. And the hilly tracts of Chittagong district, which was mostly dominated by the tribals and the Buddhist community, also eventually went to Bangladesh, although they wanted to join with India. And there had been a huge commotion and argument and fight because they wanted to retain their culture. Partition studies and narratives and focused mainly on the worst affected Punjab region, which somewhere contributed to the erasure of the East Bengal voice from contemporary debates. In contrast, the Bengal partition, which was sporadic, less dramatically bloody, and therefore less talked about, did not begin with a mass exodus. Rather, people swept the shores of Bengal throughout the preceding months and years following the partition, which continues even today and remains an area of major concern. Partition riots of Khulna, Noakhali, and Maimanshing of East Bengal finds a very little documentation, even in the largest libraries of India, and their only source remains oral history and anecdotes. So, partition of Punjab definitely sees the limelight because it was the most brutal, most gory, and it was the most traumatic. If something could be more brutal than anything else, it was the partition of Punjab. Somewhere the partition of Bengal did not gain that kind of limelight because in Bengal, the partition took place in batches. And until 71, people were still migrating in small number. And even the violence did not take place all of a sudden. It was in particular districts, particular places, because Bengal as a region had, different kind of opinions. Even people who were the Muslims, who wanted the Muslim majority nation, even among them, they were not ready to accept or part away with a different nation. So there was a sort of a cultural conflict. And the partition in Bengal, therefore, took place in batches and batches. But however, there were also tremendous riots. For example, the riot of Khulna was very pathetic. The riot of Noakhali, Maimanching, which were like the hub where all the partition, where all the, you can say, religious clashes had taken place. And we find very little documentation about the partition of Bengal, although a lot of people talk about the nostalgia, but we do not find a concrete, partition literature about Bengal the way we find about Punjab. Now, there's an interesting fact about the partition of Bengal was that Bengal, as a you can say community, had never encouraged a sort of a separation or partition. Now, when the partition of Punjab was proposed and the partition of Punjab was taking place in full force, prior to it, in fact, other areas in northern India, particularly in Bihar, there was also a lot of religious conflicts where the Muslims were forced to flee after, persecution, after harassment, after butchering. They were forced to flee, and they eventually found their way to Bengal. Now, this Muslim communities from Bihar who had escaped from the newly formed nation of India to Bangladesh instigated the Muslims in Bengal to start off the battle, to start off the anti-religious fight. And they were the primary contributors of the, you can say, riot, of the bloodshed and brutality, more than the natives over there. In fact, the natives over there, those who protested, had a sort of a patient protest, or even if it was aggressive, it didn't reach too much violence until instigated by the newly arrived refugees, who shared the common religion. And until 1971, this kind of instigation took place in and out. And when in 1971, the Bangladesh liberation movement took place, uh, these people who had migrated to Bangladesh from different parts of India, the Muslims who had migrated to Bangladesh from different parts of India, they had, they somewhere wanted to bring Urdu as the national language, and Bengali being the primary language of Bangladesh, this was their cultural heritage, and there was an utter clash there. And that was when the biggest migration of Bengal took place. The biggest refugee crisis started when, almost the large chunk of Bangladeshi Hindus migrated to the newly formed land of India. There's a third state which had undergone partition, and it is Assam, and very few know about it. Now, Assam has a very interesting history. The Kachar district of Assam was originally a part of the Bengal province, and it was later merged with Assam for commercial benefit of the British in 1874. So during the partition declaration, a referendum was issued which declared the Kachar region, barring the Karimganj, to be a part of the newly formed country of East Bengal, East Pakistan. So eventually, the Bengali Hindus and Buddhists who migrated to the rebordered India and settled in the neighboring states of Assam and Bengal, they had to, find themselves in a cultural affirmation process. Now, if we see the Kachar district, Originally, it had Bengali people residing because this was a part of Bengal. Then this province was attached to Assam for the benefit of the British. So this was again a sort of a, you can say, migration process for the natives over there. There was a cultural clash, there was communal clash, and finally, when the partition of Bengal took place, out of nowhere, Kachar was again, given over to East Pakistan. So the people who migrated from the Kachar region and the Sylhet region nearby, they had to undergo a huge acculturation process. Acculturation process is to all over bring themselves a new cultural identity, because here it is not just the you can say religion, but it is also the language they had to learn. For instance, the Punjabis who migrated from Pakistan, the only challenge for them was to settle up themselves. For them the linguistic barrier was not there, but in Bengal there was a huge linguistic barrier because the language of East Bengal and West Bengal largely differ. And in Kachar region, this was not just a linguistic barrier to a point that a person has to change the accent, but these people had to altogether learn a new language of Assamese so that they could mingle with the natives. The East Bengal immigrants who migrated to Assam and West Bengal mainly had to realign themselves, shedding off all their previous identity gaps. This realignment of identity marked a substantial movement forward in the regional identity as well as national identity. So, given the social historic context, John Bargh and Tanya Chartand are of the opinion that any assumed strategies to categorically fit in are the chameleon effect. So chameleon effect, it's a very important term, and it very much exists within refugees, not only just related to the partition refugees, but any refugee for that matter. So John Bargh and Tanya Chartand are the two psychologists who coined the term chameleon effect. So according to it, anyone's behavior that is perceived to be similar or identical conditionally, they are said to exhibit chameleon identity or effect. So what do we understand by chameleon identity? Let's say, for example, I decide to shift my place to somewhere in England, and I have to I have permanently shifted to England, and as such I have to find myself a good source of living, and to get a good source of living I have to identify myself with the natives. I have no way that I can retain my previous identity because now it is altogether gone. So therefore I take various methods, I take various means through which I can identify myself with the natives. One of the means can be learning the language, trying to speak like them, trying to speak with a similar accent, learn the local slangs or the local dialogues, behave accordingly, behave like them, maybe dress up like them, eat their kind of food, have a food habit like them. So these are the different methods that I adopt in order to become one with the, localites. Chameleon identity is something that has always taken place for the refugees, because refugees are somebody who have to shed off their past. They cannot retain their past as they have taken asylum in a new place with new prospect and new idea of belonging, and they have hopes of building a new structure, building a new identity. So the idea of chameleon effect or identity is largely applicable to the East Bengal immigrants more than the Punjab refugees. Because for the Punjab refugees, I think, when they made the migration, when they shifted to India, they did not have much difference with the people over in India. But with Bengal, there was a huge difference. Now, chameleon identity can be of different ways and different kinds. For example, the cultural changes a person talks, which I had just discussed. You can change your attire, you can change your dress sense, you can learn to look like the localites. Food habit, change the previous food habit and try to rejoice the food habit of the local. Change of the language, learning of the language does not just include learning a new language altogether. It also incorporates the fact that you have to change your accent, you have to change the linguistic dialogues, maybe the local slurs, the local terminologies, everything all together. Second would be matrimonial alliances. Matrimonial alliances is the safest way to, find accommodation in a new nation, and building up relationships and getting married to the natives and localites, just like what people do, to get green card when we go abroad. Many people who marry the natives. So these are some of the things, which are easy ways of identifying yourself. It's a part of chameleon identity. Changing of surnames was something very possible back then, because the documentation process was not there. Today, of course, we have Aadhaar card, we have PAN cards, and all sort of documentation. And even if we need to change a single letter which is legitimate, we need to go through a number of red tape and all processes. But back then, those who had migrated from East Bengal to India, for them, bringing about a change of identity or declaring themselves into a new identity was extremely possible. Particularly, those who had also completed their education in the past, maybe in Bangladesh or in East Bengal, particularly. Even for them, it wasn't difficult. They could make a change, they could apply for other things. So it wasn't much difficult. In cultural changes, people who migrated from East Bengal to West Bengal, the change largely was in the lifestyle, um, in the way of the dress, or in the way they dress themselves. uh, Food habit was, particularly because the East Bengal people uh, savored more on hot and spicy food. So they had a kind of a change of taste bud to show that, they do not belong to the refugee category. So the idea of hiding on the past, the cultural change was not just to adopt it but also hide on the past, because at any point, if your past is recognized, you also become a image of mockery. Second was the language. The language, as I discussed, the East Bengal language and the West Bengal dialect, they're largely different, and therefore learning of the new language was, you can say, the diction and the stress was pretty much a challenge, because every now and then the uh, internal mother tongue linguistic changes would disturb or get in between. This chameleon identity was also required because the East Bengal immigrants had a fear of recognition, a fear that their past might be decoded and they might be questioned. So if they are able to mix with the new place, they may not be, questioned about their past. In Assam, the thing took place in a different way. So the change of attire was changing in Mekhla Chadar, or the local native dress, or even in Northeast India, even in Shillong, those who had migrated to Shillong or Arunachal to dress up by the localites there. The food habit is again, hide up their own food habit, maybe have it in the proximity of the home where people are not seeing. And when in a social space, talk about the new place you have reached and talk about the food. Language, again, it took certain time to learn the new language, and this was an adoptive measure. This was, you can say, savior measure, which they had nothing else to do but to learn the language. One of the biggest example of the cultural change that took place would be after the uh, Bongal Kheda movement in Assam, when there was a kind of, you can say, inhibition passed on, that during Durga Puja, the goddess has to wear a mekhla chadar. And in many places, this was celebrated. So the cultural change also took place in the other way as a form of acceptability. Matrimonial alliances, yes, that very much took place. And changing of surnames was also a part of the chameleon identity, where many of the surnames, which, for example, the surname Das Gupta, many Das Guptas, they could back from the uh, Gupta, and just keep the initial Das and become one with the natives. Similarly, there are many surnames, which underwent modification, which the people deliberately changed in order to become one with the natives. There are several texts. We know that about partition, a large number of work had been done, a large number of books had been written, but even then we feel that proper documentation of it it is still explored because there are large number of people who have oral narratives to narrate. Today, of course, the witness of partition is dwindling because they have almost reached in a state where they might be towards their 80s and 90s unless they're able to recall the memory when they were too young. And there are many websites who decide to uh, document and archive this partition oral narratives. So the oral narratives are a large source of history, historical evidence, which talks about many other things that happened apart from the things that are documented in literature. And fictional narratives have always been an excellent example of how society works, and everything is documented through fictional narratives, apart from the historical books. Some of the prominent works that had always seized the attention regarding the partition of India would be, the first is Train to Pakistan, which is by Khushwant Singh. And Train to Pakistan is an excellent documentation where it talks about train being the site of mass vandalism and damage and death. So train, if we see the image of train, it largely talks about transporting, reaching you to safety or pushing you from one place to another of your desire. But the image of train here is highly distorted, and it talks about the carnage and large death. And how the image is captured here, where the train that arrived from Pakistan, where it only had blood all over inside, women's body were vehemently chopped, their breasts were chopped off their body, all the people were butchered to death. It was not a train of only dead bodies, it was a train of butchered bodies sent to India. So, this was the intensity of violence that instigated in people. And Khushwant Singh carefully portrays that how a common man can be ignited to violence, religion being our very big weakness, and how a common man can be ignited to violence, to what extent they can reach violent. Another wonderful writing would be Ice Candy Man, which is by Bapsi Sidhwa. So Bapsi Sidhwa is basically a Parsi writer, and she lived on the, I think she is somewhere from Lahore, and she talks about the perspective of partition from Pakistan's point of view, because even they had witnessed a similar kind of carnage, a similar kind of violence. It is not one sided, but this is something that went across the border to justify human nature, that human nature is not confined to any locality, community, space, or religion, but it is something triggered and instilled by something that is religion. And this was a successful attempt by the British that before they could leave, they could create a permanent barrier, which is the root cause of all fight and ugliness and border disputes even today. Ice Candy Man basically talks about the partition from the eyes of a young girl, Lenny, and she is crippled of one leg, and it talks about the partition from the Parsi perspective. So, when the partition of India took place, the Parsis were in a dilemma on which side to choose, because the countries were divided or bifurcated on the basis of religion, and they did not know if they could fit in either side. So, some of the Parsis decided to choose India as a nation, while some decided to remain back in Pakistan, and they found themselves in a highly controversial, highly contradicting situation, because Parsis were not natives to India, and they had also lived in India, segregating their communities. So this talks about again the Parsi communities version, and we also have a movie adaptation of Ice Candy Man in the name of 1947 Earth, which is by Deepa Mehta. Tamas is an award-winning book, which was later also adapted into a movie, and this is an excellent documentation of why partition of India had actually taken place, and it talks about how a person who was uh, Muslim had instigated another person to, create a riot by slaughtering a pig. He had instigated to slaughter a pig and, leave it and go. And later, the slaughtered pig was found near a mosque, and then a huge riot broke out. And this was the reason why the entire village got vandalized and massacred. And the character realizes that how his small act, which he did not even know, was responsible. So Thomas talks about the benefits of the politicians or people in power for the sake of, their own power or prosperity. They had seen partition as a means. So this, at the cost of commoners, at the cost of common people, or poor people, this people who were in good position, like the politicians or people who were landlords, they had taken up some power oath. Maybe they wanted to extract land and money, and as such, they used the religion card to trigger fight, to trigger violence. And Thomas draws a good representation of the partition image, that for days and nights, people who migrated to the new country, for days and nights, they had to hide, they had to walk without food and water. They died on the way. Many of them died on the way. Many of them were killed on the way. Many of them slept on open fields at night, and as a result, they caught a cough and cold or fever and died. And the unhealthy condition at which they slept or lived, many of them had to pretend to be dead bodies so that they were not killed and butchered to death, because the partition killing was not something, someone would shoot with a gun and the thing was over. It was a ravaging of it. It was the most ravaging and most brutal way how a person could be slaughtered to death. And in order to escape it, people had to take different measures to reach their land. So the refugees who migrated have a long history of migration, maybe for weeks or so, how they lived in different houses, how they hid behind trees or hid in the fields, and how they finally reached the place. The Shadow Lines is a beautiful work of Amitabh Ghosh, which documents the post partition effect. So, this is not written directly during the partition era. This falls in the second category of partition novel, which is written in retrospect. So, here we have this primarily focuses on the partition of Bengal. And here we have a character called Thamma, who's a grandmother and who lived in Dhaka before partition. And during partition, she had migrated to India, and comfortably her family moved on in Calcutta, and she had son and daughter-in-law. They had children. Everything was fine, and it worked out. They could settle themselves, and it worked out completely. A new family was formed. Now, what the problem lies is here is that the Thamma, when she migrated, although she has set up herself comfortably, but the memories still haunt her. The memory of her childhood, the memory of leaving a place entirely because of some violence, of her house, of her family members, the memory still lingered on. And in one moment, she wanted to go back and check Dhaka. And she could never come up with the fact that a line has been drawn in between Calcutta and Dhaka, because even prior to the migration, she often frequented Calcutta, and that time she never required a passport. But now traveling to Bangladesh became altogether a different matter, because she had to go on a flight and there were no buses connected. So the idea and the image of the person, who one fine day discovers that the land does not belong to her country anymore, she does not belong to the country anymore. She is born and raised in a country, and altogether everything is lost. So this had terribly shaken to a point when she decides to go back and visit her own place in Dhaka, where her house was there, where her father's brother lived on the next door. They had bit of fight. They had some disagreement, her father and the brother, and they decide to bring back, her Jetha Moshai, that is her father's brother. And eventually, Jetha Moshai dies in the process, because that time it was the riot of Khulna, and he dies in the process. So this talks largely about partition's aftermath that is carried on to the other generations, because Thamma eventually passed down the memories of partition to her children and grandchildren, and the reception of the images of partition lied largely, it was received at different way. So Amitabh Ghosh is largely known for his idea of imparting post memory. Post memory is a term which was coined by Marianne Hirst, and post memory talks about memory that has been transferred by a witness or somebody who had been evident to something, when the person transfers that image to another person, and the second person transfers this same image to the third person has a post memory of the entire incident. So Amitabh Ghosh narrates the idea of partition that is transferred through generations as a form of post memory that lingers on in the mind of third generation partition immigrants. The Point of Return is a book by Siddhartha Dev, which is again set in Shillong. So, as I spoke earlier about the Kachar district partition, and a lot of people in the Kachar district had migrated to different parts of Northeast India, not just Assam. So, they had migrated to Shillong, to Tripura, and all these people who migrated to all these places had to adopt the chameleon identity, in order to be one. And Siddhartha Dev talks that how these refugee immigrants who migrated to Shillong had suffered acute identity crisis. Even the second generation partition immigrants continued to suffer the identity crisis, primarily because they could never be accepted as one or one with the natives. Now, the partition immigrants in Northeast India experienced something which probably the partition immigrants in West Bengal never experienced. The first generation of partition immigrants throughout all the places had remained similar. The nostalgia, the desire to go back, fear of identity, trauma, psychological imbalance, mental imbalance, and a lot of other things. The first generation probably had similar kind of experience, but when it comes to second generation, some rehabilitation was found, some sort of identity was found, some settlement was agreed upon, particularly for second generation partition immigrants in Bengal. They could very well accept themselves in the new land because these people were born in the new land and they never wanted to desire a land their parents talked about. But in Northeast India, the second generation partition immigrant also had a similar fate because they continued to be looked down upon as the other. And these people could never understand that why were they not acceptable enough, although they were born in the land, but they were the children of the refugees. And this continued even to the third generation partition immigrant, who were still continued to be looked down as the children of the other. So the partition immigrant in northeastern India continue to be the other in the new domain, although they were born and raised there, although they have been one with the natives, and although they know the language, they know the culture, they have retained themselves into the culture as well, but still they have, lived a beleaguered identity as the other. So Siddhartha Dev captures this image and notion through the second generation partition immigrant. And here the second generation partition immigrant talks about or questions that why is he not accepted? What is the problem? He knows the language, he's born there, he's contributing to the place. But in spite of that, why are fingers raised, pointed at her, tongues waging at him? Pinjar is again largely centered on Punjab partition, the gaudiness, the brutality, and the abduction thing that took place in Punjab. And it's basically written in Punjabi by Amrita Preetam, which later got translated in English. And we also had a movie adaptation in the same name of Pinjar. So this talks about a peaceful village where everything went on in normal scale, and there were two sisters. Where the elder sister was about to get married, she got kidnapped by a Muslim family. Now, this idea of religious discord had always existed there somewhere subconsciously. And when the elder sister got abducted by the Muslim family. After 3 days, she decided to free herself. She somewhere got a chance to free herself and come back to her family. But this was the time her family refused to accept her because her chastity had been violated. She was no longer an acceptable woman. And secondly, they also had the fear that what will society say? Women were largely considered to be objects and they did not have any own existence. And if a woman who has been violated by an other men, or who has lived in the household of a person belonging to another religion, if she is brought back in the house and given a space, then the entire society is going to outcast them. They will denounce our relation with them. They are going to push them in the fringes. So the fear of being unacceptable in the society had, lingered on into the household, and therefore the family decided for this girl to go back, either to commit suicide, to die. She no longer exists for the family. And this girl realizes that one fine day, she's no longer the desirable daughter of the father. She's no longer the wanted child, the desired child, the kind of doting parents she had. One fine day everything vanished and she had no other place to go than to return back to her abductor. And once she returned back, she had to live a normal life. And therefore, although she was sad and depressed and uh, she was mentally broken and shattered, she had to convert to the new religion, get married, and settle down. This was the time when the partition broke, and she realized that her new religion made her safe on the side of the uh, Punjab she was in. She was on the safer side, where she was a majority. But however, she intended to help her family escape from there. And this also talks about how not all abduction were entirely bad. There were abductors who never ill-treated the women they abducted, or they actually they married the person they abducted and started a family. So there were also other sides of abduction, although this is very lesser in number. Lesser as in it is extremely less in number. But the large part of partition is absolutely hatred. It was built out of hatred. So there was goriness, there was brutality, there was death and bloodshed. Train to India is written by Molloy Krishnadhar, who has given us the version of the train that arrived in Bengal. And although this image of train isn't extremely brutal like Train to Pakistan, but this too talks about the political turmoil, or about how trains were attacked, and how at every stoppage they had to close the doors intact, how the drivers were killed, or sorry, the drivers were not killed, so that the drivers could carry back the dead bodies to the new place. And therefore they spared the driver, because his primary job was to collect the evidence and take it and to show, to create the kind of atmosphere, the atmosphere that was desired. Therefore, Train to India also talks about the riot of Khulna, the riot of Chittagong, and the riot of Sylhet and Noakhali, all those riots which had taken place in Bengal, which was never spoken about or never documented. Although they were not extremely brutal, but of course, this also followed by mass violence and murders, and many of the shops and factories which were owned by Hindu landlords or Hindu owners were shut down, were vandalized, and broken. One difference between the two novels is that while everything happened simultaneously in Punjab, everything took place all at the same time. In the partition of Bengal, everything did not take place at a time. The vandalizing or the murdering, the mass murdering and butchering, everything did not take place simultaneously. It was at halts and at gap and halts, and as such, it did not instantly catch any limelight. Other important works of partition is A Bend in the Ganges by Manohar Malagonkar, Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie. Midnight's Children is again it's a magic realism book written by Rushdie, where he talks about the children who were born at the break of midnight on the partition had some magical abilities imbibed in them. Clear Light of the Day, Anita Desai. Sunlight on a Broken Column by Atia Hussain. Azadi, Chaman Nahal. What the Body Remembers by Shauna Singh Baldwin. The Other Side of Silence by Urvashi Butalia. So these are some of the prominent works, where partition is presented. Now, women and children during partition. So we all know that partition was a phase where everyone had to undergo a complete turmoil where families were broken and shattered. But the people who were affected the most were definitely women and children during partition because they were the easy targets, and women were considered to be the harbingers of family honor, family repute and respect. So a good woman would bring good repute and respect. A woman, if she's blotched, if she is not correct enough, then she brings disgrace to the family, therefore she could be disowned. And as such, women were largely commodity. So the common plight or the common fate remained on both sides of the nation was that women were the primary target. And this was a gendered violence. And children after them, because children either they were abducted to be converted, children were abducted for several other purposes. Women, those who were abducted, they had to undergo the amount of savagery. It could range to anything. It is unimaginable, when the plight it comes to, it is unimaginable. It could have gone to any extent, and certainly those things had happened. Women who lived through it, who were strong enough to live through it, probably who were not killed or who were left out to live their entire life with that kind of trauma. These women, they had their mouth shut permanently because of the trauma that they had undergone. They could never speak about it. They could not bring their life back to it. And definitely, they went into deep silence that this kind of things had happened. Now, in Lajvanti, there's a particular instance where, when the exchange of the abducted women take place in the Atari border from both sides of the countries, there's a woman who reaches India who had been abducted in Pakistan, and her family did not want to recognize her. Her younger brother, whom she had fed in her lap and reared him in her childhood, in his childhood. So he was plighted and extremely sad at the condition of his sister, but he too was forced to go with the societal norms, and he could not agree to bring back the sister, and the family refused to accept. And this was the common plight of all the women. The women who returned back to the country to meet their family were not received with warmth, but rather received with disgrace. The idea that these women have come back to disgrace the family. Most of them were refused, rejected. Many were offered poison to die. Many were forcefully brought into the house, but never received any respect. There were only few who could, accept the fact and be okay with it. So, the idea of this women, all the trauma that they had undergone did not come to an end, and all these women had to suffer violence even back then. So ever since they were abducted, you can say the entire life was over. They could never, many of them decided to go back to the abductor to find some sort of refuge, but even then they many were not treated well. So the plight of the women remained common in both sides. Many of the women returned when they were pregnant, and that also became a big issue because their family were not ready to accept the child, and therefore these women were forced to kill their unborn child to undergo an abortion. And abortion took place in large scale to a point that hospitals could not admit them. And even hospitals did not permit the abortion. Many of them were in their fourth or fifth month, and even at that point they wanted the children to be aborted. Now in this process where the family forced abortion on them, either send them to hospitals or call midwives or unprofessional nurses who were not qualified enough to undergo the surgical process, or force the mothers to consume some kind of food that would remove the child. This created a lot of physical issues and death in women. When the child not only were born disabled or they died in the womb, the mothers also died because of improper, you can say, surgical process by unprofessional doctors and nurses, illegal abortions, and due to some food poisoning, the mothers also died. And the women who died in this process were unmourned, uncared for. They were not actually wanted. And those women who returned back with a child or children from the abductor, these children were not accepted. There were very few families who could accept the women with a child. Rest of them who were ready to accept the women asked them to leave the child. They were not ready to accept a child from a different community, from a man of a different community. Therefore, many women were forced to part ways with their children, who were pushed into, either a refugee camp or into, a lot of mm, orphanages. Or many of the women decided to move away with the children because these children found no acceptance. And this partition children who were considered to be born out of illegitimate licensing, or born as a bastard, or who were not acceptable in the society, had to undergo tremendous issues, tremendous problem for the identity. The orphanages were flooded with children because many mothers were forced to give up their child. Many had willingly give up their children. So the orphanages were entirely flooded. And these children who got abducted and who were pushed into the
Same
orphanages.
square, sir. It is within the same kilometer, sir. Sir. Sir.
So these children who were pushed to the orphanages, there was a huge demand for girl child, because people who the government had released a circular saying that please adopt children. They are the children of partition, refugees and victims, and please adopt them. And this was received in a negative connotation, where there was a huge demand for the girl child, because either they wanted to bring them home and reduce them as slaves or as workers or maids, or maybe have an ill intention. So more than the the male children, they wanted the female children to be adopted. And this again created an issue, because the children were not received with a kind of kindness, but with a different ideology, with a sort of a negative intention. And again, the NGOs and the government had to intervene in between. So the children could not find a proper space, a proper acceptance back by then, and they had to leave the same kind of beloved identity either in the orphanage or somewhere abandoned. Although the mothers knew where the child is and they could barely go to meet around. So the children and women were largely the victims of the partition. So when we talk about partition today, most of us wonder that why do we talk about it? Because this is something of the past, and the partition immigrants of Punjab had been permanently rehabilitated by 1960 by, either through job and giving them all provisions possible. All as per the government scheme by 1960, all the refugees of partition of Punjab were permanently rehabilitated. This is something that did not take place in Assam and Bengal, primarily because the partition in Bengal kept on going, sweeping in batches and batches, years and years until 71. And even after 71, even today, it takes place in small batches, which has become a national crisis, where the government wants to put a hold, but they are not able to understand the effect of it. So it is too late to understand about the partition of Bengal, and nothing could be done about the refugees and immigrants who had a different identity crisis, a suffering of a different identity crisis there. So the memories that have been, passed down through the generations, to the second generation, to the third generation, and even the fourth generation, that got fragmented, that got twisted, that got reoriented in the process. And particularly, memories of women who have been raped or who have been physically violated to all extent, who were able to pass down the memories to the next preceding generations. It is largely questionable, because how these generations have received the memory of partition. Do they bear some kind of hate or grudge, or or they are able to come in terms with the fact that it was a phase when people were engulfed with hatred, and later on, humanity could be restored into it. So memories that have been inherited about partition is a largely questionable sphere, because these memories of the second and third generation are not direct memories, but they have been passed down. So they have there's a lot of autobiographical memories included into it, a lot of transnational memories included into it, psychological memories included into it. So they have been passed down through generations, and that is what will continue to take place. Today, of course, we have very few, witness of partition living, because this already we have passed on to the second and third and fourth generation, and the memories still continue to go ahead. And as long as the memories are transferred, the partition will keep haunting. So this was my discussion on partition, uh, in brief. And as I have already told you, I'm working largely on the partition of Assam and about the identity crisis in Assam, and how the inherited memories continue to exist. So partition is something, if we look today in today's context, then it is not something that is confined to a nation alone, because today, immigrants have spread across the entire nation. And it is only when we dig in the past we come to know about the haunting memories that continue to prevail, and the identity crisis that suffer, and the fear that lingered therein. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this very nice and informative session.
You're
If
welcome.
if anyone has any question, you can ask.
Okay, I think we don't have much questions here. Anyway, so I have a class from 3 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll take leave of you.
Okay, ma'am. Complete session.